The biggest day of the Democratic primary campaign is here. Welcome to Yahoo Finance's Super Tuesday live coverage in collaboration with Yahoo News and HuffPost. I'm Andy Serwer. 14 states are holding primaries today, and Yahoo Finance is live from 3 of the big locations at stake. Melody Hom is in California, Jessica Smith is in Virginia, and Kristen Myers is in Texas. Joining me here on set, HuffPost Editor-in-Chief Lydia Polgreen, Yahoo News Editor-in-Chief Dan Kleibman, along with Yahoo Finance's Rick Newman and Max Zahn. This hour, we're covering some of the biggest issues in play with voters that will likely influence the outcome of tonight's results. Everything from immigration to rising healthcare costs, to the homeless crisis, to the mounting anger against big tech. Let's start with the big picture, Lydia. 1,300 delegates in play here tonight. What are you expecting?
Well, I think there are 2 big things to watch for. Does the Biden surge hold? I mean, we've seen Biden really accumulate a lot of moderate support. His main rivals, with the exception of one very, very big, very rich one, Michael Bloomberg, have dropped out and endorsed him. So clearly he's been able to consolidate the moderate wing. So the question is, are we going to see a rally around Joe Biden as the alternative to the insurgent wing, which is really led by Bernie Sanders? I think a lot of people are looking at Bernie Sanders' performance in this race in states like Nevada and thinking, wow, he could do really well in California. He could do really well in Texas. Those are big delegate-rich states. So we're going to be watching those really closely tonight.
And Danny, does it really come down to Bernie versus Biden at this point? Elizabeth Warren is still out there, and then, of course, there's Mike Bloomberg.
I think in terms of the battle for the nomination, this is a 2-man race right now between Bernie and Biden. Elizabeth Warren and Bloomberg can still, sort of be spoilers in this race. And if they choose to go all the way to Milwaukee, which I think is unlikely, but it's hard to know, this could well end in a contested convention. And Bloomberg, for example, could try to block Biden, block Bernie at the convention by giving his delegates to Biden.
And Rick, what do you think the critical states are?
Well, California is probably going to go to Bernie Sanders. Texas is the one to watch. And by the way, these are all split. So these are not winner-take-all states. If you can get to the 15% threshold, you get some delegates. I think in terms of looking for changes within the narrative of the whole race, I mean, Biden has been, I have my action figures for illustrative purposes.
That's terrific.
Biden has been on his back for the last 2 months, and only in the last 10 days. Biden springs to life, and suddenly he's the big storyline here. So I've been following the polling before South Carolina, and after South Carolina. Biden, of course, has come up. These polls are kind of unreliable at the state level, but he became competitive in 3 states where he was far behind just in that 10-day swing, and that's Texas, North Carolina, and Virginia. So if Biden can pull out a win in any of those states or all of those states, I think his momentum will intensify.
I would say if these polls are reflected in the vote, this will be an astonishing turnaround.
Absolutely.
If you look at where he was just a few weeks ago.
He was moribund.
And he was moribund. And I think it bears sort of thinking about why this happened. And look, Joe Biden was a very popular candidate with a large part of the Democratic electorate. Great, nice guy, empathetic, household name, and of course that association with Barack Obama.
Right.
And then he started to debate, and it rattled people because he didn't perform well. It looked like he'd lost his edge, and then he started to lose, and it rattled people further. So it looked like he was dead. South Carolina, huge, resounding win, and he gets all these endorsements. He starts to campaign well. And he gave people a reason to believe, to quote the old Rod Stewart song.
And some more money.
Hey, Max,
and money.
What about the convention, just quickly? Is that a scenario we're building towards that could be just a big clash?
Yeah, I think something fascinating about the convention and speaking to this surge of Biden's is that we've still have Warren and Bloomberg in the race, and they're potentially going to get a decent delegate haul tonight. We'll see how they end up, but they're beyond the threshold in many of these Super Tuesday states. So if they are emboldened by that performance, and it's in part empowered by the dropout of Buttigieg and Klobuchar, and they stay in this race, potentially it decreases the opportunity for especially Bernie Sanders to compile a lot of delegates, a lot of momentum going into that convention. And if Bloomberg potentially drops out, we heard today reporting from Vanity Fair that his advisors have instructed him to drop out, then we could see Biden surge and continue to go into that convention, and we'll see what happens that dynamic between Sanders and Warren. But potentially, if both of those two candidates fall short of majority going to that convention, it could be a matter of hundreds of delegates.
But should just quickly say that was the Vanity Fair report was forcefully denied by Kevin Sheekey.
There's a
Bloomberg's campaign
lot
manager.
going on here today. And Lydia, I want to talk to you a little bit later about some of the issues besides just the candidates that people are focusing on. But before that, let's go to some of our reporters in the field. Jessica Smith, who's in Fairfax, Virginia. Jessica, what have you been digging into right now?
Well, we've been digging into the brokered convention, just what you guys have been talking about, a brokered or contested convention. It's something that political experts talk about and speculate about every year. But this year, as you've been mentioning, it's looking like it could be a possibility. So here's how it would work. In order for a candidate to secure the nomination, they need to get a majority of the pledged delegates. There are a total of 3,979 pledged delegates who vote in what's known as the first ballot at the convention this summer. Half of 3,979 is 1,989 and a half, so round up to 1,990. A candidate has to get one more than that, so the magic number is 1,991. Those delegates are awarded by the results of caucuses and primaries. More than a third of them are up for grabs today. By the time the convention rolls around, if several candidates did well with voters, there's a chance no one will reach that magic number on the first ballot. That scenario is known as a brokered convention. The first ballot has not failed to nominate a candidate since 1952, but if that does happen, candidates would have to work to convince delegates to support them on the second ballot, which could mean some extra drama in Milwaukee. On the second ballot, there are votes from two sets of delegates: the 3,979 pledged delegates who could vote for a different candidate this time, and the 771 super-delegates. A candidate has to reach a majority on that ballot, too, to secure the nomination, so the magic number this time would be 2,375.5. In theory, there could be multiple votes until a candidate reaches that magic number, but political experts say that would be very damaging to the party ahead of the general election. Andy?
I almost have to say, you got all that? But let me ask you instead, so who are these super delegates, Jess?
Yeah, the super-delegates are basically party insiders. They can be members of the DNC, Democratic members of Congress, Democratic mayors. They could be just distinguished leaders in the party, like former president. You may remember at one of the debates, a moderator asked the candidates if the person with the most votes or with the most delegates at the end of this should be the nominee, whether or not they have a majority. Only Senator Sanders said yes to that, and that could be because he could very well be in that position by the time the convention rolls around. And in recent days, we've heard from Warren, Biden, and Bloomberg spokespeople, even the candidates themselves at some point, saying that they are going to fight up until the very end. So we'll have to see how this plays out today. Could make a big difference.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I mean, there's some complicated stuff going on there. And Lydia, is this something, people can follow or people care about? What do people really care about out there?
I mean, I think that the question of a brokered convention feels very abstract and obtuse to most people. I mean, people are focused on the core issues that are driving this campaign. Healthcare. Obviously, a lot of people are paying attention to coronavirus right now, which is linked to healthcare, obviously. We're talking about jobs. We're talking about the stock market. The kitchen table issues that really occupy people's attention. But I think the one really big issue that a lot of people are thinking about is electability, and there are lots of different ways to define that. And there is one camp that believes you need a strong, moderate candidate in order to go up against Donald Trump, and it appears that the momentum is coalescing around Biden to be that strong, moderate candidate. But I think there is another part of the party that thinks, oh no, what we really need is a revolutionary, because we saw what played out in the GOP nomination last time around, and you ended up with a very unusual but ultimately very strong candidate who was able to upend the status quo. Now, I'm not saying there's any equivalency between Trump and Bernie, but clearly
well,
I mean, maybe you think so.
Well, I mean, just in that they're disruptors.
They want to play both.
And they're not. They're not.
Yeah.
Right.
They want to blow up the system.
Right.
Policy
Yeah. I mean,
wise,
that's what I meant by
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I mean, a lot of people that I talk to think, Bernie Sanders, if he's the candidate, he's either going to be president or George McGovern.
Yeah.
And no one really knows the answer to that, right, Rick?
Well, it's funny. Some of the exit polls show that people who say they're voting because of electability reasons, Sanders supporters think he's the most electable candidate. They think he can beat Joe Biden more easily than Trump. And there actually is some, I think, questionable polling data. These, if you put this Democrat, all the Democrats up against Trump, Sanders actually does pretty well. There are reasons to doubt that. That's national polling. It doesn't focus on, the 6 or 7 swing states. But the Sanders people think he's the man who can beat Trump.
So, Rick, when you mentioned Texas as perhaps the most important state in today's election, I think you're exactly right. Texas is kind of a microcosm for what these candidates are going to have to do. And for Bernie, his election is really premised on being able to expand the electorate. He is going to be trying to get young voters out in numbers that they have never come out before, Latino voters in numbers that they have never come out before. And we'll see tonight when we get returns from Texas whether he's been able to deliver on that promise. Right. So far, in the 4 contests that we've had in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, he has not really done that.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe he'll be able to in Texas.
All right, let's go out to California now and check in with Melody Hom, who's been doing some reporting on the ground there, speaking with the former mayor of Los Angeles about the 2020 race. Melody.
Yeah, Andy, and Dan aptly pointed out that young voters and Latinx voters are key, not only for Texas, but also for California, and really bode well in our message for the overall electorate thinking about Super Tuesday. I want to point out that the Latinx population is expected to be the largest non-white ethnic minority group that votes today, making about 13.3% of the total voting population. And even if you look at LA County, where I am now, they make about 50% of people who are expected to vote today. I did speak with former LA Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa about the innovation that's happening, and he happens to be the surrogate for Mike Bloomberg and is part of the campaign.
Right now in this state, Bernie Sanders is winning. He's got more delegates across than any of the other candidates. But I think what you're going to see is that Michael Bloomberg is going to continue that steady climb above. In fact, it was because his campaign was on ascendancy that in the first debate, everybody ganged up on him. And in the second one, a few continued. His campaign is moving up at a time when many of the people on the debate stage are moving the other direction.
So I do want to point out, Andy, Bloomberg has spent over $500 million on the campaign since he launched it exactly 100 days ago, poured in $77.4 million in California alone for TV and radio ads. And to be honest, he has not really made a dent in sentiment. Anecdotally, I've spoken with many voters today, and not a single one mentioned Mike Bloomberg as their candidate of choice. And even Villaraigosa aptly points out that he's having some trouble and struggling to really reach and resonate with the Latinx population.
All right, Melody Hom in Los Angeles, thank you so much. Coming up, immigration and President Trump's border wall are among the most hot-button issues for Texans voting in tonight's primary. Kristen Myers breaks it down for us right after the break. Welcome back to our live Super Tuesday coverage. Yahoo Finance's Kristen Myers joins us live from San Antonio, Texas, where immigration is a critical issue for many voters. Kristen.
Hey, Andy. So yeah, as you guys were talking about earlier, Texas is massively important tonight. We've got 1,357 delegates that are up for grabs tonight on Super Tuesday. Texas is going to be handing out 228 of those. Now, according to the latest polls, Biden and Sanders are neck and neck, and in our informal polling that we did a little bit earlier today with voters, they are also saying that they are voting between Biden or Sanders. Now, the ones that went into the poll booths and picked Biden said that they actually did not do so very easily. It was a pretty tough decision for them because for them, they said it was all about electability and who was going to be able to tackle Donald Trump in the general election in November. Now, I have some numbers for you that have been forecasted by 538. Biden has a 55% chance of winning the primaries tonight. Sanders has a 44% chance of winning, so it's pretty even there. They say that he's going to be taking over a little bit over 80 of those delegates, with Sanders bringing in about 80 and a half. Now, I spoke to one voter earlier today who said that immigration was one of their top reasons for voting in this election. He voted for Sanders, which he said was because of his values and because of reasons like immigration. Here's what he had to say.
My great-grandfather came from Mexico, and, you know, I was able to provide for my family, and I've been blessed, and my immediate family and my extended family have been blessed because of the decisions that they made and because of the opportunities that the United States has provided. I think that they should continue to provide those opportunities for all types of dreamers. I mean, we're making a big change in this world, and you know, they really need to be given that opportunity and not just be enclosed in cages and built walls 10 miles high.
Now, again, Texas has 5 million immigrants living inside the state, and that is the reason why voters like Armando Valiz say that immigration is so important to them. Back to you, Andy.
All right, Kristen Myers in San Antonio, Texas. Thank you very much. So, electability and immigration, two big issues. Let's talk about immigration a little bit first, though. Dan, what are your thoughts? And it's not just an issue in Texas.
Well, first of all, it is not just an issue in Texas. It's an issue all around the country. To start with, in this primary campaign, assuming that it is going to be Biden versus Sanders, there's a big divide between those two candidates. So immigration is going to play out in the rest of that battle. Bernie is for decriminalizing the border, and Biden said, I think in July at the debate in Detroit, absolutely not. Dead set against it. So there is a very clear contrast, at least on that issue on immigration, between those two candidates. And then, for the general election, we talked before about the importance of Latinx voters in this election. They really are going to be heard in a way that they have not been in previous presidential elections. That is an issue that obviously is going to inspire a lot of Latinx voters to get involved and probably in very large numbers vote for whoever the Democratic candidate is. And obviously, Bernie has been making a very strong play for Latinx voters.
Yeah, and to speak to that play that Bernie's making, a part of the dynamic going into today's Super Tuesday between Biden and Bernie is that Bernie raised way more money than Biden did. He built an organization with that money, and part of that organization that they tout and what they say worked in Nevada is that they did reach out to Latino voters much more than candidates have in the past. They've been thought to have forgotten that demographic, and Bernie made a point of building, organizing early, using that money to reach out to them and simply ask for their vote. And they claim that that worked in Nevada, and they say it'll work again. We'll see what happens with the results here on Super Tuesday.
I think the T.O. Bernie phenomenon is very real. Bernie holding these events where they're serving up tamales and talking with voters about the issues that matter to them. I think that the Nevada example does seem like Bernie could have an edge. In Texas, I think you have a slightly more conservative Latinx population, and I think that that's going to be a significant factor in how this all plays out. California, possibly less so, but Texas will be really interesting to watch.
I have two questions for Lydia and Dan. First of all, Beto O'Rourke endorsed Joe Biden. Will that make a difference in Texas? And the second one, is there any chance Texas could actually go blue in the general election?
I mean, I think there's a good chance that Texas could go blue. I think it would be a very, very hard slog. There certainly are the demographic shifts there, but I think it would have to be just the right candidate who hits just the right buttons that, marries the Latino vote with the suburban vote, around cities like Dallas and Houston, where I think there are folks who have soured on Trump who are winnable. I think the question of whether Beto helps or not is a really good one. I mean, Beto didn't win. So.
He helps for the Vanity Fair vote, maybe. What is your take?
On Beto, I think, I'm sure he probably helps marginally. I think what really helped is that Biden was able to get those three endorsements, very quickly after the South Carolina win. So Beto, obviously, but also Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg, and it just looked like he had real momentum. And I saw Beto at the Dallas rally, and it was a reminder that he really does know how to get a crowd excited. And he did not do particularly well in the presidential race. Maybe he should have run against John Cornyn in that Senate race. He's a pretty talented politician. I think we're going to see a lot more from Beto.
I think there's no shortage of candidates in 2024. So stay tuned for that. But we have more to do here this evening. Coming up, the D.C. suburbs of Virginia have become the epicenter for the boom in defense spending and government spending. How much are ballooning U.S. deficits weighing on the mind of voters tonight? That debate next. Welcome back to our live Super Tuesday coverage. Defense spending is critical to Virginia's economy, and it's one of the key issues driving this year's primary in that state. Jessica Smith is live again in Fairfax with the details. Jess.
Yeah, when I talk to everyday voters over the past few weeks, they tell me that Medicare for all, climate change, housing are all of the issues that are top of mind. But I wanted to find out what the business community in particular was watching ahead of this election. Virginia's economy is closely tied to the federal government, to federal spending, and especially defense spending. Bob McNabb is a professor at Old Dominion University. He studies the Commonwealth's economy, and he says that business leaders are paying very close attention to the candidates' defense policy plans. Some candidates, like Senator Bernie Sanders, want to decrease defense spending. Here's what McNabb says that would mean for the Commonwealth.
Such reductions would undoubtedly dramatically impact the economy here in Hampton Roads. where we have not only the U.S.'s largest naval base, but also where the carriers and other ships and submarines are built and ships are serviced. So a reduction in DoD spending would not only grab people's attention, but would act as a drag upon the economy of the region and the Commonwealth overall.
I also talked to the Virginia Chamber of Commerce CEO, and he echoed some of those same concerns. He says that business leaders here want a presidential candidate who will encourage investment in the nation's defense and infrastructure. Andy.
Thanks very much, Jess Smith in Virginia. Max, I'm going to go over to you. Are young people, you're a young person resident here, are young people fed up with defense spending, or maybe they think a strong America is a good thing?
I mean, young people in this race are clearly predominantly backing Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders has been a critic of forever wars that the U.S. has entered. He's gone after Joe Biden for his support of the Iraq War. And a lot of that goes along with a criticism of defense spending. And his retort constantly when his campaign gets criticized for big programs like Medicare for All is that you never talk about the spending bill when it comes to defense. You never talk about it when we're extending these wars for decades. So young people have backed Sanders, and it suggests that's where they stand.
Let me go the other way with you then, Lydia. I mean, can the Democrats elect someone maybe who is big on defense, who thinks that we need to keep that Pentagon budget going?
It's possible, and that could be seen as a way to appeal to military voters. I mean, we saw in the midterms, for example, significant success with candidates who had military and national security backgrounds, especially in states like Virginia, where there are a whole lot of them around. You know, these are people with decorated backgrounds of service to their country who make for really appealing candidates to, particularly to moderate voters. So I think that there is definitely a market for that type of politics.
And a bunch of those candidates are up for re-election in Virginia and are going to be very nervous about a Bernie Sanders candidacy. And the down ballot effects of that. So Abigail Spanberger, for example, and a number of others.
If it comes to that. Coming up, the homelessness crisis is gripping many cities across the U.S., perhaps no more than Los Angeles. Do any of the 2020 candidates actually have a solution to solve it? Our live Super Tuesday coverage continues right after this. Welcome back to our live coverage of Super Tuesday. I'm Andy Serwer. 14 states are holding primaries today, and Yahoo Finance is live from 3 of the big locations that are at stake. Melody Hom is in California, Jessica Smith is in Virginia, and Kristen Myers is in Texas. Let's check back in with Melody Hom in Los Angeles. She's been speaking with voters about one of the main concerns California residents are focused on, homelessness. Melody.
Andy, as Democratic strategist Doug Herman told me, homelessness and the housing crisis here is the top concern, bar none, for Californians. And I want to point out that 150,000 homeless people do sleep on the streets and shelters in the state of California. And nowhere is it more visceral and tragic than Skid Row in downtown LA. Herb Smith is the president and CEO of the LA Mission, which is one of the nation's largest service providers for homeless needs. And he has been at the helm of that foundation for 14 years. He sounds a little bit jaded as he thinks about the 2020 slate of candidates and their half promises, their piecemeal solutions to solving this crisis.
I'd like to see them break out their philosophies a little more. I'd like it not just to be about housing, but about the services and necessary wraparound support for individuals, both permanent and temporary. Let's face it, there's not enough trillions to pay for everything that everybody wants to give away.
That was Herb throwing a little bit of shade, perhaps, at Bernie Sanders, who has the most ambitious and aggressive plan. He has pledged $32 billion over the course of 5 years to invest in making sure shelters are in tip-top shape, investing in affordable housing. And I have to point out that Elizabeth Warren and Bloomberg have not been so detailed with their plans. So overall, even Governor Gavin Newsom of California has called it a crisis and emergency. President Trump has taken to Twitter many a time criticizing the state and its handling of it. But as Herb pointed out to me, revenue has been flat from federal and state legislators over the last decade. So it's not as though he's seeing more resources come in.
All right, Melody Hom, thanks very much for that. Rick Newman, let me ask you, what the heck is the matter with this country? I mean, we're the wealthiest nation on earth, and homelessness is growing. And maybe more to the point of tonight, are there any candidates that have plans to realistically address this?
We're all frustrated with Congress. Nothing ever gets done in Congress. They don't seem to be tuned into what people really need in their lives. And the same problem seems to be at stake here in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles. I mean, also here in New York, where we're sitting. Housing affordability is, I think it's one of those problems. It's not really a federal problem. I mean, so we do have a federal Department of Housing, and they provide incentive money and create some policies to try to help localities. But this is the kind of problem you have to solve at the local level. I mean, zoning is involved, building restrictions, what you can get developers to do, incentives for developers. Well, we all know Trump has been really critical of San Francisco in particular because that's Nancy Pelosi's hometown, so it's an easy target for him. He says they totally don't have their act together. He's criticized Chicago, but he hasn't done anything. Yeah. And part of the reason is I don't know that he has any policy to do anything, but I'm not. It's just a very hard problem for the federal government to address.
I think it's a big local issue also in California, right? I mean, it's on the one hand, we have a crisis of inequality in this country. People working in low-wage jobs, they're not able to afford housing. But there's also a supply problem. And the reality is that through, local laws, that were passed and zoning and all these types of regulations that keep a ceiling and a lid on how much housing can be built. And you have people who own their homes who don't want to see the value of their homes go down because more supply is on the market. That's a pretty basic economics 101. So until you change that fundamental equation in this country, I think homelessness is here to stay.
Yeah. I think Melody mentioned that Elizabeth Warren didn't have one of the more detailed plans to deal with this problem, but she does have a plan about rent policy. And that is, I think, a key to this larger issue, because if you have more rent controls implemented and other ways to keep rent affordable. I mean, huge numbers of people, most people rent housing in this country. You're supposed to own, and increasingly. So, there are different ways of this problem. The thing about Trump is, you can say he's been president now for 3.5 years almost, and he hasn't done anything about it. That doesn't really matter to Trump. He is so effective at taking a mess like what you see on the streets in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and making it look like this is a, this chaotic, awful issue that is, and laying it at the feet of Democratic policymakers and politicians in California, that could end up being an effective issue for him.
It's a blue city thing. And Max, I mean, is this really an issue that Democrats can run on? I mean, they need to offer solutions, but the president kind of has an advantage because he says it's your problem, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I would take issue a bit with it not being a federal issue, because here in New York, we've seen the Public Housing Authority get defunded over the years by the federal government, and the state and the city can't make up for those funds. And under Bloomberg, I mean, homelessness got worse by 71% greater number of people under his administration over the years. And so part of that is Bloomberg's fault, perhaps, but it also does come down to getting defunded by the federal government. So the way it's manifested in this race is a tax on wealthy people. I mean, you've seen that be a repeated point in the race, not only from Bernie Sanders, but really from every candidate in these debates. There's been a tax, and Bloomberg, a billionaire himself, has said he's raised taxes on the wealthy. So the fine points about how to alleviate a problem that really affects people who may not show up at the polls and these politicians may not care as much about as they say, I think manifests by these attacks on the wealthy.
Right. Well, and there's a lot more besides just housing as well. All right. But coming up, the rise in healthcare costs, which is probably another issue, is one of voters' top priorities this Super Tuesday. The Attorney General of Texas speaks out to Yahoo Finance on the future of Obamacare next. Coverage. In Texas, healthcare is top of mind for many voters. Kristen Myers is live in San Antonio with more. Kristen.
Hey, Andy. Yeah, so we talk a lot about immigration when we talk about Texas voters, but healthcare, as you just mentioned, is also top of mind. I have some stats that I want to run through with you. Texas right now has the highest uninsured rate in the entire country. It's over 17%. Now, to put that into context, in the United States, the uninsured rate, is a little bit over 8%. So that rate here in Texas is double that of the entire country. And the state also declined to expand Medicare, one of 14 states that decided to do so, which would have given coverage to over 1 million people. Now, the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, is the one that was leading the charge to sue the government over the Affordable Care Care Act, also known as Obamacare. I asked him a little bit earlier if he thought that that was going to make voters decide to go Democrat in these elections instead of sticking with the Republicans. Here's what he had to say.
I think a lot of these people are going to see through this once they have the opportunity to have a choice. If you'll remember, the promise was that you get to choose your doctor, which ended up not being so true, that the price would come down, which clearly is not true. And what we hope to offer is more choice, more opportunity for the consumer to decide who they want to see, and hopefully much lower pricing. Under Obamacare, they also tried to tax the states to help keep Obamacare financially stable, which, by the way, was also unconstitutional. So there have been promises that it would be financially stable, and that is just not proven to be true.
Now, I do want to mention here that the Supreme Court has decided to hear that case about Obamacare. It's a little too complex to get into the full details of that lawsuit right now, but essentially it all hinges around that individual mandate, which was the ability of the United States government to tax people if they did not decide to have any type of health insurance. Back to you guys.
Kristen Myers in San Antonio, thank you. Let's bring back our panel. Rick, how important is health care?
Extremely important. And we just heard a Republican Attorney General not talking about trying to meet people's needs today. Everybody knows health care costs too much, out-of-pocket costs are too much. This is a huge issue for voters. He's still talking about the Affordable Care Act, which passed, it's 10 years old now, and some Republicans are still trying to repeal it, which I think is just, I think the Republicans have already lost on that issue, and they're just continuing to try to lose.
This is why they want to run against Bernie Sanders,
That's right,
not against Joe Biden, because they don't want to talk about the Affordable Care Act. They don't want to talk about taking an entitlement away from Americans. They want to talk about a revolutionary that's going to come in and with a socialist government takeover of healthcare. That's the conversation.
This is a real advantage if Democrats play this right, and it is a moderate rather than Bernie Sanders. This is a real advantage for Democrats in the general election because Biden has, let's extend public health care to more people while leaving the current system in place. People hear that, they're like, sounds reasonable to me. No one's going to lose their plan. Biden should have learned that lesson from Obamacare, but we're going to help more people. I think that's a good message, and the Republicans got nothing on that.
I just have to jump in here and say,
Please.
I'm not so sure, right? Because, I mean, let's look at what's going on with coronavirus right now, right? We, one of our reporters, Emily Peck, did some reporting on this, and the reality is, if you have one of these crummy Obamacare plans with a super high deductible, guess what? It is March, right? You probably haven't paid up your $5,000 deductible on your crummy Obamacare plan, so you're going to hesitate to go to the doctor, right? You're going to hesitate to get the care that you need. So I think this idea that, and they tried this in Nevada, right? In Nevada, there was this question. They tried to get the Culinary Workers Union all worked up. You're going to lose your union plan if you go with Bernie Sanders. Guess what? They went with Bernie Sanders. I think that we're underestimating the unpopularity of Obamacare as it currently exists.
And Lydia, to your coronavirus point, I saw before going on set today that the Trump administration is actually thinking about paying for people to get coronavirus care if they don't have insurance. So they are running scared on this very issue.
By the way,
you mentioned.
Let me just interrupt. It really depends how Democrats play it, because part of the Biden plan, the Biden healthcare plan, is fix the parts of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act that don't work, and that you just hit on one of them. So some people really got screwed with just got stuck with paying $20,000 or $30,000 a year for premiums. That has to be fixed, and there are proposals to fix that. So if Biden is the guy and he runs saying we're aware of that problem and we're going to fix it, he's got something. If he just ignores it and says more government, I think you're right.
Lydia, you mentioned one of your reporters, and shifting gears a little bit, what are some of the other topics that they think are important right now, stories that you guys have?
I mean, I think the things that we're talking about, one of the big things that we're hearing about is gender and diversity. We're talking about a Democratic primary here, right? So getting away from the sort of general election discussion of who can beat Trump. But we started out with a really, really diverse field, and we've ended up with, a bunch of white people in their 70s, and one woman. So I think that that's an issue that a lot of folks have been talking to our reporters about and concerned about that. And the other big issue is, of course, electability. Who do they think can win? Who can beat Trump?
Right.
So
Danny, what about your people?
Back to pure politics for a second. I was in touch with Hunter Walker, who's on the campaign trail. He's in Burlington.
For Yahoo News.
For Yahoo News with the Bernie forces. And he was telling me that the Bernie people are a little scared. They're a little spooked by this Biden surge. They're worried about Texas. I think for some of the reasons that we talked about before. Texas is a place where I think Biden should be able to show some of his real strengths, perhaps with African-American voters, but also with upscale suburban voters. And they're going to need to show that they can really turn out the youth vote and the Latinx vote. And I think what the Bernie people, I'm hearing from our reporters, are beginning to do is really start thinking about the attack plan when it becomes a Sanders versus Biden race, and I think you're going to start seeing the airwaves begin to fill up with ads about Biden's position on Social Security,
Charisma?
questions about whether I don't know he's going to go that far, but Social Security and then also trade. That is going to be these trade deals like NAFTA. That's going to be a huge.
Can I toss?
Max, wait, I want to bring Max in here and ask you about. You spoke to a voter in Massachusetts about her support for Bernie Sanders. What was that conversation like?
I did, yes. I was at a rally in Springfield this weekend and spoke with a supporter, Emily Fleming. She's 18, and she said that healthcare is the reason why she supports Bernie Sanders.
Getting back to your point.
And yeah, I mean, for her, it excites her. It's that because his plan is so ambitious, it'll energize the party and is sort of demonstrative that his promise of democratic socialism is embodied in that platform. And listen to what she said.
He's a socialist. He supports Medicare for all, free college, and he's gonna basically save America. I feel like because the increasing cost of healthcare is destroying people's lives.
Yeah, and then we get back to electability. The first thing out of that young woman's mouth is he's a socialist. And that may play in Massachusetts, but
as a compliment, as a good thing.
Exactly.
Which goes to that generational divide about the term socialism, which is so interesting.
But it also goes to various parts of the country too, Danny, right?
Absolutely.
And that word does not resonate so well. Right, yeah.
And it's interesting you say the campaign is spooked because at the same time, when he did become a front runner, he really didn't moderate the message. He attacked Wall Street. He continued to attack establishment instead of perhaps broadening, though the strength of his message discipline maybe is what has been so good for him.
Pivot may not be a word in Bernie Sanders' vocabulary.
Right.
We'll find out.
Yeah, exactly.
If he needs to.
All right, you guys, straight ahead, Amazon's HQ2 in Northern Virginia is becoming one of the largest targets in the backlash against big tech. We'll hear from some of its most vocal critics coming up next. Welcome back to our live Super Tuesday coverage. Housing affordability is a point of contention in Virginia due to Amazon HQ2. Well, Yahoo Finance's Jessica Smith joins us now with more. Jessica.
Andy, Northern Virginia has always been an expensive area. It's right across the river from D.C., but home prices have really soared since Amazon announced HQ2 was moving to Arlington. Realtor.com put together some research for Yahoo Finance and found in January 2020, the median list price of a home in Arlington was up 29% year over year. And since October 2018, a month before the announcement, the median list price in Arlington has increased by $431,000. Now, that is not solely because of Amazon. Low mortgage rates also played a role in that. But Realtor.com says in Northern Virginia, every mile closer you get to HQ2, the home sale price goes up more than $11,500. So $11,500 per mile. I talked to one local realtor, and here's what he's saying.
First-time home buyers particularly are frustrated because they're having difficulty finding properties that they can afford. This is already a very expensive area. So sometimes they're just putting off the buy decision for further down the road until they have more money in their pocket to really buy their dream home.
I did talk to a few voters over the weekend who said this is an issue that they're thinking about as they head to the polls. A few of them said they don't know how much a president could do about home prices in this area, but they said if they were able to address income inequality or bring the cost of health care down, that would at least free up money for people that they could put towards a home. Andy?
Jess, I wanted to follow up. You also asked voters about Jeff Bezos. Did they have anything to say about the richest man in the world?
Well, I didn't even... Yeah, I didn't even ask them about it. I just talked to a couple of voters as they were coming out of the polls. This is the first time they have voted in a presidential race. And I asked who they voted for. They said Bernie. I asked why. And they said because he'll tax Jeff Bezos more. So I didn't even have to bring it up. They said that they wanted the most wealthy people to pay more. And I did ask why they chose Bernie over Warren, because Warren has also made it a point to say that she is going to tax the wealthy more. And they said they just don't see her winning, and they think it's going to be Biden or Bernie, so they had to go with Senator Sanders.
Jess Smith in Fairfax, Virginia, thanks a lot. Unprompted, bringing up Jeff Bezos like that. And Max, you were talking to voters about that distinction Jess was just making between Sanders and Warren. What did you find out in Massachusetts?
Absolutely, yeah. So out there, when I was out there, it was a two-way race between Warren and Sanders. Interestingly enough, this morning a new poll came out showing that Biden is surging in the state. But between Sanders and Warren supporters, the distinction drawn on the side of Sanders supporters was that they see his long-held beliefs over decades in office that say the same thing again and again. And they look at Warren, who's moderated that position some over the course of this presidential race, and they say, we don't know if we can trust her when she gets into office. Now, her supporters say, listen, that's a strength of hers, that she can speak to a broader coalition than the Bernie supporters, and in a general election that will serve her to defeat Donald Trump. Now, I spoke to one voter in Springfield who loves Warren, who's volunteered for both of her campaigns, but is going to support Bernie Sanders in this presidential race. Listen to what he had to say.
For me, the decision was, did I have enough of a reason to move away from Bernie and support Elizabeth, who I dearly love and have campaigned for twice for Senate. But I felt I should stay with Bernie. He's a little bit closer to my political values and beliefs as a social democrat.
Yeah, some real deep thinking there, too. And again, you hear social democrat socialism in Massachusetts, and I'm not sure how that's going to play writ large in the United States of America. But, you know, we're talking about a state primary, and then we're talking about the Democratic Party. So those are important issues, I guess, then.
And I think the battle between Warren and Sanders has even more pressure on it. Now that you're seeing consolidation on the side of Biden in this race, how voters on the left make the distinction between the two of them is going to become all the more important, and especially for Sanders if he really wants to contend for this nomination.
Okay, some final thoughts here, Dan. What are you going to be looking for at maybe various points in the evening? I know you're staying up to watch.
Well, we talked about the states that we're going to be looking at. California. Obviously, you know, the differential in delegates between Bernie Sanders and And Joe Biden is really going to make up the differential in delegates across the entire Super Tuesday set of states. So that obviously is going to be key. We talked about Texas. I'll be looking at a state like Virginia, which we just talked about, where Biden seemed to be surging according to the polls. I just want to say one sort of larger point that I've been thinking about a little bit today, and since Biden started to do better, which is I think there actually has been a very healthy debate within the Democratic Party about whether we need a more revolutionary approach and agenda that Bernie Sanders represents, or whether we need something a little more modest that Biden represents. And I think in stark contrast to the 2016 Republican primary, this has been a race where the Democratic Party has, we'll see what happens, but has been able to sort of have a healthier way of do we go with one or the other, as opposed to everybody else on the other side just kind of falling out, dropping out.
Right. Lydia, final word goes to you.
I would very much agree with Dan. I mean, let's not forget that one of the debates during the Republican primary basically centered on a question of who had the larger you-know-what. So clearly, having candidates having detailed policy agendas and big ideas is a great thing. I think one of the most exciting things about this campaign has been the flowering of extraordinary ideas. People didn't take Andrew Yang very seriously, but I think he's come through as one of the most original political figures of the last 20 years. He'll probably be our mayor here in New York City. That would be very interesting. His idea of $1,000 per American is a really interesting one. The boatload of plans that Elizabeth Warren has, I think there's a ton of stuff there.
The most policy-driven campaign in my lifetime in a lot of ways.
So much more to talk about, but so little time, you guys. We are going to have to wrap up the program. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Stick with Yahoo Finance and our sister publications, Yahoo News and HuffPost, for more Super Tuesday coverage tonight and tomorrow. Have a great evening.